This is How Curious from KGOU, exploring your questions about Oklahoma. I'm Claire Donnelly. Oh, through here? Or this way? Okay. Oops. In the western section at Michael's Old Books in Oklahoma City, there are hundreds of paperbacks with colorful covers. Pictures of cowboys holding pistols or riding horses through tall prairie grass. They have titles like Red Runs the River, Bandit Gold, and The Vigilante. A handful are by author Louis L'Amour. KGOU listener Joe, who lives in Choctaw, emailed How Curious and said, according to Choctaw lore, Louis L'Amour lived here for a time. Can you tell me where he lived? L'Amour wrote several hundred novels and short stories, starting in the 1940s.
At his death, he had sold about 200 million, maybe 300 million now. No one even comes close writing about the West to the popularity of Louis L'Amour.
This is Richard Adelaine.
I'm an 80-year-old retired history professor with a specialty in the history and literature of the American West.
Adelaine says L'Amour's books really became popular in the 1950s, and something like 40 of his books were turned into movies.
So he really capitalized on a very popular period of things about the American West, both in fiction and in film. That's the high point for John Wayne, too, in films. And so in 1953, he publishes his first novel that's very well known. Oh, he had written some before that, called Hondo. And eventually it will star John Wayne in a film.
According to Adelaine, L'Amour's westerns follow a typical pattern. There's a good guy, a villain, and a virtuous heroine.
You get him turning his hand by the adjectives he would use. And so within the first 2 or 3 chapters, Louis L'Amour will have already clearly in your mind which ones are the rascals and which ones are going to be the heroes.
So if he describes one cowboy as thoughtful and another as ruthless or bloodthirsty, it wasn't by accident.
He also was very interested in places, spots. He bragged, and so did a lot of his readers, that you could go to the very specific place in his novels and see where he had pointed out exactly what the place was like.
And L'Amour had a particular writing style.
We call them periodic sentences, subject, verb, object for the action, and then paragraphs of description.
Adelaine says each chapter usually ends on a cliffhanger, something that makes you want to keep reading. For a lot of people, these kinds of Western books were, and are, a way to escape. Adelaine calls the Old West a romantic place, or a never-never land that takes us away from everyday life.
The good guys win. The bad guys lose. And the good guys, if they're really good, win over the heroine.
L'Amour's stories were full of exciting adventures, but Adelaine says that often meant the minds of the characters are kind of blank. They're not doing much thinking or reflecting.
That's a trademark of a lot of popular fiction. They're not cerebral books. We read them not for so much the ideas as for the actions that occur, the people that act.
Adelaine met Louis L'Amour at a conference in the 1970s.
He could spin stories that were wonderful. And I think it had to do with that he was a vagabond traveler, nomad himself, and he learned stories by all his travels.
Louis L'Amour was born in North Dakota in 1908. His family traveled throughout the western United States starting in the mid-1920s, after financial troubles forced them to move. According to an online biography, Louis L'Amour baled hay in New Mexico, worked in the mines of Arizona, California, and Nevada, and in the sawmills and lumber yards of Oregon and Washington. He also had a sporadic career as a professional boxer.
My dad was a very kind of playful guy when he got away from work.
This is Louis' son, Beau L'Amour.
He was always up very early in the morning, and he really prided himself on being the first one up. But once he was up, he got lonely.
So he had to come up with ways to get his kids up.
One of the more obnoxious things he would do sometimes is play records that had different strange sounds on them, like wolves howling or the most irritating one was he discovered that the beginning of the 2001 A Space Odyssey soundtrack has this low tone, this low kind of rumbling tone. And if he turned the volume up enough on that section, the sound would actually feed back, and it made a sound very much like the 1971 earthquake, which had scared us, scared the bejesus out of us.
Beau Lamore now co-manages the Louis L'Amour website. He's also finished and published some books his dad started. Now, back to the how curious question. Did Louis L'Amour live in Oklahoma? Beau Lamore says yes. Louis's brother Parker Lamore bought a property in Choctaw, and Louis and his parents lived there from 1931 to 1942. During that time, Lamore wrote a series of short stories called Yondering. But where exactly was the house?
I have lost track of it. I was there once, so it was a place called Wymena Farm, and I believe it was on Rural Route 2.
Now, that's when it gets a little bit fuzzy.
This is Oklahoma County Assessor Larry Stein. His office determines property values.
We went back to the 1800s trying to find out through the court records and clerk records, land records, purchases. Did anybody named Lamore, Parker Lamore, own any property?
Stein says there's nothing in the records, but Lamore could have lived on the property without owning it.
When he called up his parents or sent them a letter saying, gosh, I'm living in near Choctaw, Oklahoma on a ranch. And you know, the parents love children. And they always want to do, so they probably run and say, oh, yeah, my son Parker, yeah, he's doing pretty well. Down in Oklahoma, he's got a big old ranch. I bet he's got probably 1,000 head of cattle down there. But, you know, all he said was, I'm living on a ranch in Oklahoma County near Choctaw.
I tracked down Louis L'amour's census record from 1940. It lists his home as Cass, Oklahoma. That's in Oklahoma County, but it doesn't list an exact address.
So I guess we could just say, claiming it for the entire 720 square miles of Oklahoma County, we say Louis L'Amour lived here.
Thanks for listening to How Curious. The show is a production of KGOU Radio. It's produced by me, Claire Donnelly. This episode was edited by Caroline Halter. David Gray composed our theme music. Special thanks this week to Sheldon Beach and Chad Denson.